Today we're going to be talking about economics and how contemporary economics relates to the issues that we have been considering to date. The overarching question that frames the discussion, at least from my standpoint, is whether economics is a help or a hindrance in addressing these issues of productive inclusion and joining the rest of the economy with the knowledge economy and disseminating its benefits within economies as well as globally. And I will be playing the role of defending economics, which is not the role I usually play, except when I'm with Roberto. But I'll be happy to do that.
Actually, we all think it's a help and not a hindrance for the question. How much?
Good. So we're already starting ahead. So that's good. So I want to talk about three things in the introductory set of comments. One, I'll make the argument that mainstream economics, contemporary economics, is actually very flexible and malleable. That can be used for a variety of purposes. The second topic focuses more narrowly on the tools of economics, and in particular the role of models in economics. And I want to make the argument that models, even though typically criticized and derided from the outset from the outside as being narrow and useless because they're so abstract and simplified, I want to make the case that in fact they're incredibly useful. And third, I want to move from economics and economic models to economic policy paradigms, making a distinction between economics and economic models and economic paradigms. In many ways, what we've been engaged in our discussions here is really about the construction of a new economic policy paradigm. And I want to underscore both the distinctions and the similarities between how economists approach these questions in their scientific endeavor and in how they think about economic policy paradigms, which I think is a distinction that we need to make. So let me start with the argument about the flexibility of mainstream economics. And I think one way to make my argument is to set it aside against what may have been a straw man, but it's really not a straw man anymore because there is such a close association today in the minds of many, including many critics of contemporary economic policies, of which we are an example, but a close association between mainstream economics and what has come to be called neoliberalism, as if one implied the other and vice versa. I think this close linkage in the public's mind between mainstream economic ideas and neoliberal policies is expressed in terms like the Washington Consensus, market fundamentalism, key shortcuts to economic policy such as stabilize, deregulate, liberalize. But it is a stronger argument can be made, I believe, that neoliberalism has been a misapplication of good mainstream economics rather than its straightforward application. And I think to understand why, I think we need to understand that the development of contemporary neoclassical economics is remarkably flexible and admits an almost infinite variety of policy remedies. This may be hard to believe for anybody who's sort of seen only Econ 101 and has only seen sort of free market or perfectly competitive versions of economics. But if you study economics in its full complexity, in particular, the further you go into the study of economics, the more you understand that, in fact, the variety of policy remedies or policy recommendations that one can get out of economics is really virtually almost infinite. There's a quote that I like to use sometimes to make this point from an economist by the name of Carlos Diaz Alejandro. And he wrote, "By now, any bright graduate student, by choosing his assumptions carefully, can produce a consistent model yielding just about any policy recommendation he favored at the start." And when he said by now, he was actually writing in 1974. And sometimes I joke that you don't even need to be bright anymore to be doing this, given how much time has elapsed and the technology of writing economics papers has improved so much. So the short of it is that really mainstream economics can be used to justify any number of policies and institutional arrangements by specifying the background conditions, the context, variety of market failures or lack thereof appropriately. But then you might say, sort of, where does this association between neoliberalism or Washington consensus and market fundamentalism and mainstream economics come from? So let me illustrate where I think some of this association can be easily made by a particular thought experiment. I call this the thought experiment or a thought experiment of an airplane economist. And so what you have to imagine is a well-known and very distinguished economist gets off the plane in a poor developing country with lots of problems and poverty and destitution and sort of all kinds of inflation and everything off kilter. And he's accosted as soon as he gets off the plane by a variety of policymakers and journalists, and they tell him, look, what do we have to do? You're such a well-known economist. Tell us what we need to fix. And the economist says, look, this is my first time in this country. I really don't know anything about your economy, so I really can't say anything without much greater study. But he's pressed further by the audience to say, but you've written so much on economic growth, on economic development. Surely there are certain general policies and recommendations you can tell us without knowing much about our economy that would be able to guide us. So the economist is really feeling bad. On the one hand, he knows that he really shouldn't say anything because he really doesn't know much. On the other hand, he feels like sort of they paid for his ticket and he has to show something. So he starts talking and he says, well, we economists believe that efficiency of resource allocation is really a critical determinant of any economy's performance. So I would start by paying attention to questions of resource allocation and allocative efficiency. And one thing that we economists have really focused on is on how efficiency requires aligning the incentives of households and firms with social costs and benefits. So getting the incentives right matter. Beyond efficiency, of course, we care about economic growth over time, economic dynamism, and that requires a system of property rights and contract enforcement that ensures that those who invest can retain the returns to their investments. And alongside property rights, there must be also a certain degree of openness to ideas, to innovations, to inputs, and goods from the rest of the world. So by now he's getting sort of into his groove and everybody's taking notes. And so he continues, he says, well, economies can also be derailed by macroeconomic instability. So governments must pursue a sound monetary policy and fiscal sustainability. They must carry out prudential regulation of financial intermediaries to prevent financial system from taking excessive risks. And then he says, just in case you think I care only about economics and growth and macroeconomic stability, it's important to underscore that economics is not just about efficiency and growth. Economic principles also carry over to how you think about equity and the design of social policy. And while we economists have very little to say about the desirable level of redistribution in society, we do emphasize the importance of reducing the incentive distortions that might be created by redistributive policies, so that when you create social policies and taxation systems and redistributive policies to take equity into account, that you need to pay attention into these incentive distortions. So by the time the economist has finished his presentation, short speech, it appears as if he has really laid out a full-fledged neoliberal agenda, right? Because a critic in the audience has heard all the neoliberal scare words: efficiency, incentives, property rights, contract enforcement, sound money, fiscal prudence, right? All of these things, he said, were important. But when you think about all of these things, and think a little bit about how we've used these terms in the current context in our discussions, these, you might call them universal principles of economics about the importance of these concepts. These, in fact, are very open-ended. They do presume a market-based economy, one in which economic decisions are left largely to individuals and firms, but really not much more beyond that. And they admit, and that's the critical point, a variety of institutional arrangements. So I think a typical mistake is to associate the functions that good policy regimes perform with a particular type of institutional arrangements. So when I said the importance of getting the incentives right, or getting property regime right, or ensuring macroeconomic instability or sound money, I actually wasn't telling you anything about how to do those. And if when you heard that, for example, when you heard contract enforcement, you immediately associated that with a particular legal form of property, or Western system of courts, or even third-party enforcement through legal regimes. Or when I mentioned the private incentives to invest, you immediately associated that with free deregulated markets. Or when I mentioned macroeconomic stability, you immediately associated that with things like independent central banks or currency convertibility and openness to capital flows. Those aren't the things that this airplane economist actually said, because he was talking about the functions that good policy institutions, good economic policy institutions must perform to be successful, right? He wasn't talking about how you design those institutions in the first place, what form they take, which is really the hard thing about how to get those outcomes right, okay? And that's really where all the action is in terms of designing those institutions, okay? So economics tells you about these, sort of in terms of what might be universal in economics, universal in the sense that general concepts you can articulate without even knowing anything about a context. You can talk about things like the importance of property rights, about getting incentives right, about getting the rule of law, about sound money, fiscal sustainability, prudential regulation. But the questions, the interesting questions, are really the specific ones about how you get these things achieved in a particular context. What kind of property rights should we have? What type of a legal regime? What is the right balance between decentralized market competition and public intervention? Which types of financial institutions and corporate governance regimes? What is the appropriate role of industrial policy, if any? How independent should the central banks be? What is the appropriate exchange rate regime or your convertibility rules? Should fiscal policy be rule-bound? And if so, what are the appropriate rules? What is the size of the public economy? Should the government be 15% of the economy or 45%? What's the appropriate regulatory apparatus for the financial system? And so on. These are all the kinds of questions that actually would have been helpful to the audience of the airplane economist, but that's not what the airplane economist talked about, because being a good economist, he articulated only those things that are generally universal without really getting into how you would actually do them. And neoliberalism in that context, or the Washington Consensus, is one particular implementation of those universal principles. What that implies, and what that means in terms of how economics responds to questions that we might care about the role of policy and how do we get the policy right, is that to virtually any question of interest in economics that has some operational content, that is to say, it will tell you something about what you should do or what you should expect, that the only answer in economics that is always correct is it depends. So does freeing up trade enlarge the size of the economic pie? In other words, is free trade good in the sense of enlarging the size of the economic pie? The answer is really indeterminate, even if we leave or ignore questions about distribution and broader measures of well-being besides just the size of the pie. So that conclusion about free trade expanding or maximizing the size of the pie is correct only under specific assumptions about the absence of market imperfections, whether it's monopoly power, whether it is poorly functioning labor markets, whether it is inadequate fiscal capacity, or the absence of learning or technological spillovers. Another question, does the minimum wage reduce employment? Okay. Now that was actually one of the most favorite questions of economists in Econ 101 until recently, because after all, the question is really about, it seems like the slope of the demand curve. And demand curves, economists believe, tend to slope downwards. So raising the minimum wage should reduce the demand by employers for workers. And that was a typical example of an answer that you can give that's definite in economics. But it turns out that not only once you admit some market power on the part of employers, if a local Walmart or if a local other retailer has local labor market power in the sense that they can actually help determine local labor market wages, it turns out that their behavior will not be characterized by a nicely downward sloping labor demand curve, but it'll be characterized by imperfectly competitive behavior. And as long as the minimum wage actually is not too high, you can show using the logic of economics that actually a not too binding minimum wage can increase employment rather than reduce employment. You might think that's just a theoretical curiosum. It turns out that the evidence from last 10, 15 years of empirical economic research has shown that in fact in a lot of contexts, a rise in the minimum wage not only did not reduce employment, in many cases it increased it. That was part of the famous credibility revolution in economics, the work of Alan Krueger and David Card, for which David Card received the Nobel Prize in economics. Third question that you think might be sort of readily answered by economics. Remember, the first one was about whether free trade expands the size of the pie. The second one was whether an increase in minimum wages reduces employment. Third one, does more competition enhance innovation? Okay. There too you might sort of be inclined that economics just says yes, more competition should increase innovation. Yet, but you delve into models of industrial organization, innovation, technology, and it turns out that the answer is anything but simple. There are a whole variety of models where, in fact, more competition would reduce innovation. And some of the simplest logic as to why the relationship might be reversed is that monopoly rents are one of the strongest inducements for innovation. It's the presence and prospect of monopoly rents that incentivize innovation, and in fact, more competitive structure reducing monopoly rents may very well undermine it. Let's be very careful. In each one of these somewhat counterfactual from the standard neoliberal standpoint results, I'm not arguing for the prevalence of the counterintuitive outcome. I'm just saying that we don't know. that it could be one or the other. Now you might say, well, what use is economics if it basically, the only answer it gives is that it depends, that it depends. Could it be any sort of useful? So it seems like we've gone from one extreme to another. If you thought that economics was neoliberalism and you thought neoliberalism was for the birds, well, clearly economics is not useful. But I'm telling you, economics actually is not neoliberalism. It's actually very open-ended. The answer to every question in economics is it depends, and maybe again it's for the birds because what the hell is it useful for? And here I come why I think economics is useful, because economics is useful because in each one of these contexts, in response to each one of these questions, economics tells us what the answers depends on. That is to say, it's not just it depends. I can tell you also what it would depend on. So I can tell you under what conditions free trade would increase the size of the pie, under what conditions it wouldn't. I can tell you under what conditions a rise in the minimum wage would increase employment and under what conditions it wouldn't. I can tell you under what conditions more competition would induce more innovation, under what conditions less, okay? And why is that useful? Well, that's useful because you learn how to apply economics in context by asking, are those conditions relevant to the setting in which I'm working for, right? It also helps figuring out what works, where, and when, and why, right? That's how empirical evidence in economics becomes useful, by showing the dependence between context and outcomes through the working of economic ideas. And here is where economic models come to play a role. Now, economic models is, I think, the critical ingredient for economist thinking, right? If we need a systematic way of thinking and understanding how context or real-world complications affect the conclusions, in other words, what it depends on, right? We need a machinery for teaching that to us systematically, and economists use models to do that. Right? So models are essentially, every one of you must have seen at least one model, which is the demand and supply model. Right? That's only one model, right? Because, for example, in the monopsony employer case, it turns out that the labor demand drops out. That's not relevant anymore. Something else. That would be another model. So models are essentially deliberate abstractions that shed light on complex social reality by detailing a variety of causal relationships, one at a time. So it provides an inventory of partial explanations, with emphasis on partial, right? So what becomes critical in this context is being able to select the right models and apply it to the context. So think about economics as a kind of a library of models, and the role of an economist being able to pick the right book from that library, the right model from that inventory. John Maynard Keynes, as usual, put it best. He said, economics is the science of thinking in terms of models, joined to the art of choosing models that are relevant to the contemporary world. Right? The science of thinking in terms of models, joined to the art of choosing models that are relevant, or they apply to the setting in question, right? So it's interesting, it's talking about models as a science part, but the part about choosing the right model is kind of an art. And it's true that it still remains an art, it remains a craft, because after the fact, you may have the luxury of formal testing of alternative models and figuring out which one was the right one. Formal models of evidence and causal inference such as RCTs, randomized controlled trials, can tell you whether it was one model or the other one that was the appropriate one. But often you can do this only after the fact, and often many settings, like many settings of macroeconomic policy or industrial policy or labor market policies may not be conducive to carrying out RCTs or using techniques with very precise causal inference. Right? So when you're applying models in real time, as we are doing here, it really becomes an art. It becomes a craft because you're never really sure whether you're picking the right model or not. And I think in that sense, Keynes was correct. Now, models are often blamed for just being, overly simplistic. I can't tell you how many times I've read somebody criticizing models because they're just too simplistic. They don't reflect reality. They're unrealistic, right? But in the context of economic science, that's a feature. It's not a bug, because models are meant to be simple because they illustrate causal relationships in as clear and as transparent a manner as possible, one at a time. Okay? So in that sense, models are like maps, like real physical maps, right? Now think about the subway map, the New York City subway map, or the map for the T in Boston. Imagine that for a second. Is that realistic? Has very little correspondence to the actual underlying geographical or physical reality of the city, right? Is it useful? Absolutely, because it tells you on what line you get and then what's the station before or after, right? Or think about a walking map of downtown Boston. Have you seen any of those maps, right? It'll just focus on the features that you want to focus on, the monuments and the sightseeing, and everything else will have disappeared. It's not at all realistic, right? But it's extremely useful if you're going on a walking tour, right? Or think of a bike map. You'll have only the bike paths. Walking map will have, or the highway map, right? We'll just have the main highways only. And the others will be all, so these are all useful. So just because they disregard reality, they're unrealistic, doesn't make these lack any usefulness. Exactly to the contrary, because if they reflected every feature of the underlying reality, these maps would be unusable. They would not be helpful at all. And that's exactly how models are useful. So it's not a criticism of models to say that they lack realism. It would be as silly to say that the T map for Boston is not realistic, because the distance between two stations is not exactly sort of correspond to physical distance. Right? But where do we get into trouble? Now, this is the part about the craft or the art of choosing models, the second part of the definition of what economics is from Keynes that I just gave you, right? Is when we pick the wrong map. Imagine you were going on a bike trip, but you took the subway map with you. Or you're going on a walking tour, but you took the highway map with you, right? Now that would not be a happy experience, right? You're not going to end up going, you'll be lost, and at worst you'll end up somewhere you didn't want to go, right? And that's where economists tend to go wrong with their own models. It's about picking the wrong model to apply, right? So from that perspective, the criticism of neoliberalism or the Washington consensus would not be that economics just offers simplified models, is that the Washington consensus or neoliberalism was the application of one very particular model or one particular map almost universally to a whole variety of settings where it didn't apply. Right? So that is the sense, for example, when we look at some of the most remarkable transformations in the world economy in the last few decades, and it's hard to find one that is more impressive than China's economic transformation. And global poverty reduction, right? Economists' models, economists' maps still provide tremendous insight into what is it that actually worked in the Chinese reform process. Because the Chinese reformers after 1978 get the incentives right? Absolutely. That's how they got agricultural productivity up. That's how they got industrial investment up. Did they get macroeconomic management and macroeconomic stability right? Absolutely. Did they get openness right? Openness to ideas and openness to goods and inputs from the rest of the world? Absolutely. Right? So my airplane economists, when he described the things that you need to do, you can use those concepts to understand China's economic reforms. But of course, the specific institutional design, the specific policies through which China achieved these ends were nothing corresponding to neoliberal economic policies. China used industrial policies, managed its currency, managed the capital flows. The state played a very important role. It opened up to the world, yes, but it did it in a very sort of, sequential and, two-track kind of a way, just, opening up parts of the economy but not the others, and so forth. So these were all taking some of these, critical ideas of economics seriously, but then applying it to context. So none of this is to say that economists don't go wrong. I offered you sort of my best defense of economics and economics models, the key tool that they used. I think failures of economics or failure of economists arise when they mistake a model for the model, right? That's, I think, what happened with neoliberalism. There was a case of overlooking alternative models with different implications, whether it was in the trade domain or in the macroeconomic domain. When they exhibit categorical preference for certain axioms, so for example, a bias towards the assumption of rational, forward-looking individuals operating in perfectly competitive markets. So if you always take that as your benchmark, then if you have a bias towards certain axioms, you might go wrong. Economists also go wrong when they prefer questions that are amenable to the available tools that they have, rather than attack questions that might be more relevant. Just look for answers using tools that you know how to use. So for example, even though scale economies might be, or knowledge spillovers might be important in the real world, if you neglect those features, or you neglect departures from rational behavior, because the analytical tools you have at your disposal are more tractable when you don't take those complications into account, then you can go wrong. And finally, I think economists often go wrong when they engage in what I'd call implicit political economy theorizing, right? So that economists often forget that their training doesn't endow them with any way of evaluating alternative social states other than through the lens of allocative efficiency. Right? Now, that economists can do. They can evaluate different outcomes from the perspective of allocative efficiency. Right? But that's a very narrow normative lens. So go back to one of the questions I asked before. Is free trade good? Right? So no well-trained economist should be allowed to say yes to that question, right? Because good is such a loaded normative statement, right? You have to ask, what do you mean good? Now, if you define good in an operational manner, economists will have a lot of things to say about it, right? But all that the economist is able to answer with any degree of precision is the question, does free trade enhance efficiency? Or what are the distributive implications of free trade? And then the economist can give you a litany of conditions under what one outcome as opposed to another would obtain. So again, the value of knowing what it depends on. So let me now transition in just the final set of things I want to talk about is transition from economics as a science of models to thinking about economics as actually kind of a paradigm for economic policy. Okay, so I want to make a distinction between economics or mainstream or neoclassical economics as a discipline with its own scientific tools and ways of working from an economic policy paradigm. So the easier way to make that transition is to ask you to go back and think about neoliberalism or the Washington Consensus, right? Those were economic policy paradigms. Because a policy paradigm basically tells you what to do or what to prioritize. It provides you a particular lens, okay? And often, we do need policy paradigms. We need policy paradigms because, as I've just spent some time arguing, mainstream economics comes free of immediate policy content. You can stretch it in any direction you want by providing the right assumptions or providing the right set of details on context. So to make economics useful in a practical way in the policy world requires supplying additional content and context. And that's what policy paradigms do. So you can think of a paradigm to relate it to my previous discussion of economic models. A paradigm is a kind of a meta model. It is rarely articulated or explicitly tested as a meta model, but underlies how we think about the economy and its relation to society and the polity. So it's there, and that's how it provides a general orientation for policy. So it is essentially a set of maintained assumptions. Maintained assumptions in the sense that they don't change. They're not allowed to vary across context. So these are maintained assumptions about the nature and prevalence of market failures, which market failures exist, how important they are, do they matter. They are maintained assumptions about government objectives, capabilities, intentions. What do governments actually really do in the real world? Do they have the capability? Do they have the right intentions? That implicit political economy theorizing I mentioned before. They are maintained assumptions about the possibilities of collective action in diverse spheres. Can people actually get together? What's the role of civil society? What's the role of NGOs? And they're sort of maintained assumptions about what are the binding constraints on economic prosperity at any point in time, right? So the neoliberalism was that the maintained assumption was the binding constraint was that markets were too restricted, that the government was interfering too much. So too much government intervention is the binding constraint, and therefore the direction for policy becomes clear, reduce that intervention. So you take those maintained assumptions about the nature, prevalence of market failures, government objectives, capabilities, intentions, the possibilities of collective action, the identity of binding constraints, and then you connect them with an implicit prioritization of values that we want to put forward. Now, these values might be in tension with each other. So they would include things like efficiency, equity, poverty reduction, resilience, stability, national security, personal freedom, social cohesion, right? So these are normative goals, and some of them might be in tension with each other depending on our institutional context. But it's an implicit prioritization of those goals along with those maintained assumptions. So neoliberalism was one such economic policy paradigm, but so was mercantilism, so was classical liberalism, so was the Keynesian welfare state, so was market socialism, so was developmentalism, so is perhaps economic populism in its variety of forms, right? So in many ways, what we've been articulating here is the search for a economic policy paradigm that we need in our current context, what we mean about sort of the new political economy that we need. So it has a clear connection, I believe, to the economics models, in which economic models do play a useful role, but that relationship is actually quite contingent and quite contextual. I'm very aware that I do believe we need a new paradigm, but I approach the question of a new paradigm with a certain amount of reticence because every paradigm comes with a downside. The downside of paradigms is that by the time they become conventional wisdom, they often turn into cookie-cutter solutions and develop blind spots that render them inappropriate to changing context, right? Remember, economic policy paradigm is useful to the extent that it solves a contemporary set of contextual problems with a given set of values. But what if those values change, right? We de-emphasize efficiency and emphasize supply chain resiliency, for example, or we de-emphasize economics in favor of national security. And these are always changing, as well as sort of the nature of underlying maintained assumptions might change. So as an economist, I'm torn between an approach that says that we're better off teaching our students to learn how to navigate among competing paradigms, and that might be a better approach to just sort of talking about a simple one. And I'm also aware that I think paradigms that economists explicitly reject today also continue to hold certain truths even in other days. So mercantilism would be, for example, a kind of a curse or swear word in economics today. You can, basically, if you call it mercantilist, you're saying, he or she doesn't know anything about economics. Yet there are many truths in mercantilism about which we've actually examined in this course about the need for close collaboration between the state and private sector, the need to develop a national vision for development, the fact that what you produce matters rather than simply what you consume. Those are all fundamental mercantilist messages, still remain in some sense very true. So beware, I would say, beware economists bearing policy paradigms. And I think that's a degree of skepticism that we always have to carry. But we still need a kind of an animating vision for policy. And to that extent, I believe that talking about new policy paradigms still is important. So let me stop here.
Maybe we should have a little bit of discussion.
Okay. If there are questions. Yeah.
I was wondering, do you think that as economic models get more mathematically complex, it becomes more or less useful to assessing real-world situations?
Yeah, I mean, so so what you mean by complexity, the mathematical complexity of models might be several different things. So the virtue of models, as I've argued, is actually their simplicity, the fact that they are transparent. You can see quite clearly, sort of if you tweak this, that will happen, or that this result depends transparently on this assumption. So, again, in the context of supply and demand, very clearly that tax incidence depends on elasticities, right? So, that makes it, boom, it's very clear. So if you move in the direction of making the model more complex in the sense of adding what you might think would be more realism, right? You lose that transparency. So many, an extreme example of that, of course, is LLMs and a lot of AI, right? Which is you have no idea, right? You just throw a bunch of stuff at the computer, and the computer does a whole bunch of pattern recognition, and then it throws out an answer. So they might be the AI model might be predictively accurate, but it doesn't give you understanding unless you basically have other methods through which you can figure out what is the how that particular result has been reached. So complexity in the sense of adding more detail is not a virtue. Now, if you meant mathematical complexity, we're using more advanced math, right? We're using just algebra, then we're using calculus, then we're using, I don't know, intertemporal optimization and dynamic methods. And so that's just, you should always use the method that is the most appropriate. And sometimes, a question requires, different kind of math, so that's quite okay. So I don't know if I answered the question, but the mathematical nature of the model is not to make the model complex. So again, another one I tell my students when I'm teaching models is to say that, we use math in economics not because we're smart, but because we recognize we're not smart enough. Because if the math is to make sure the conclusion follows from the premises, right? That's the only thing. It's just for logical consistency. So if we actually could establish logical consistency without math, and there have been Nobel Prize winners in economics that don't use any math beyond a diagram, then you don't need to use it. So it's not, so the math is not, something that adds anything except for logical consistency. And that, I believe, is something when Roberto talks is going to criticize us for, because essentially, he'll say, again, remembering from past discussions that economists have just become sort of logicians using just abstract logic, but nothing else. But I hope I
would say.
I'm not giving you any weapons to criticize me. Any other comments, questions? Yeah. Yeah, you.
I have a question about, as you mentioned, LLM. I'm curious about this, trade-off between predictability, how well it predicts, versus the explanation, how much we understand it. Do you think for economists, the model that perfectly predicts but doesn't understand what's happening within it, like a black box, do you think that's valuable to economists?
So it depends. I mean, first, if you want understanding, right? So if you want to understand how the world works, understand why a certain shock produces a certain outcome, right? A black box then is obviously not very helpful. But sometimes you're interested only in prediction, and then if you have a model that, if you have a framework or a quantitative model or AI that does a very good job of prediction, then you might be okay, except that there's always the risk that the underlying background changes. So because the AI has optimized against a given set of relationships, understanding gives you a way of tweaking the results if you understand what the model behaved on. If you rely only on predictability, you have only a black box. So you have then no way of extrapolating a result to a different context, or not understanding. Suddenly the model starts, not working. It doesn't predict anymore. Yeah. Anything else? Okay.
Can I speak?
Yep.
Okay. So let me begin with two propositions before outlining a criticism of the dominant tradition in economics. The first concerns this term economics itself, which Danny used many times in his initial address. What is economics? You might think economics is the study of the economy. But economics is not the study of the economy. That's the first proposition. It goes back to something we said at the beginning of the course. Economics is a study of a particular approach to the economy that was invented at the end of the 19th century and it remains the core of the contemporary study of economics in most places of the world and for most people. A way of thinking about the economy that was invented at the end of the 19th century by people like Walras, Jevons, and Menger. Now, my second proposition concerns how we understand anything, what the task of insight is. And my claim is that true insight is always transformative. The way we understand something is to imagine it. And to imagine what it can become under certain interventions that we produce or that are produced by shocks from the world. If we can't understand how it is transformed, we don't understand it at all. We just stare at it. And then insight degenerates into retrospective rationalization. The crucial step, the crucial work is the work of the imagination. And the imagination has two moves. The first move of the imagination is distancing from the phenomenon. The image, after all, is the memory of a perception. And the second and vital move of the imagination is to subsume the phenomenon that we're trying to understand under a range of variations. To imagine the actual phenomenon as one of a set of possible variations. So we rob it of some of its brute just there-ness, its facticity, and we represent it, we reinterpret it as just one variation of a set of variations. Not of the ultimate possible, but of the adjacent possible, the theirs to which we can get from here. That's how we understand any social phenomenon and how we understand any natural phenomenon. Now, by that standard, which is the standard of insight, what are we to say of this dominant tradition of economics? It's very good at some things, and it's bad at others. And what it is most alarmingly bad at is the task of insight. It's good at presenting us the bill. It was called already by Malthus the dismal science. It knocks at the door and says, here's the bill. Here are the constraints. These are the trade-offs. That's what it's good for. It's bad at this leap of imaginative insight. That's going to be the central theme in my remarks now. Now, the common view of the dominant economics, the popular criticism of it, is that it is a crude simplification of what economic behavior is really like. And it assumes that people are maximizing automata as if they were machines, and this is ridiculous because that's not what people are really like, and that's not what markets are really like, and so forth. Now that characterization of the error of economics is something that the economists, the people who carry forward this tradition that I'm going to criticize, cannot take seriously. They just shrug it off and say, well, that's what the masses think, but that has nothing to do with what we're attempting. They have a completely different conception. And I think that in this respect, they're right, that the true errors of this tradition have nothing to do with this popular conception, but are of a completely different nature, and that's what I'm now going to address. And I want to claim that this dominant practice of economics, invented at the end of the 19th century, suffers from four crucial flaws, which operate together to disable it from performing the task of transformative insight. The first is the separation, the discontinuity between formal analysis and empirical study. One could say at the end of this criticism that in the contemporary economics, there's a great deal of analytic rigor manifest in this construction and replacement of models, and there's a great deal of empirical study. but they have very little to do with each other. And now I want to explain why. So, the starting point of the marginalist economics is the situation of the individual agent making comparative choices against a background of scarcity. So it's instrumental rationality. How can I maximize the satisfaction of my goals or desires? Choosing among the available options within these constraints of scarcity. So to the extent that that idea has any causal content, it's just a shadow of causality. It's just a suggestion of causality. As the residual causality in the situation of the individual choosing the way in which to maximize what he wants among the existing options and within the constraints of scarcity. There's no real causality there at all. And what happened in the development of marginalist economics is that the marginalist theoreticians exploited the analogy, the similarity of this situation that I just described to logical reasoning. That's what happens. There's an analytic situation, and if there's going to be any causal hypothesis, any causal theory, the causal theory either has to be imported from the outside, from another science like psychology, or it has to be invented on the spot ad hoc. The analytic apparatus itself is free of causal assumptions and claims. And now I want to tell you why. It's free because the marginalists deliberately, living as they did in Europe in a period of intense ideological conflict and conflict over clashing views of society, like the liberal view, the Marxist view, wanted to develop a science that would be as pure as possible, as free as possible of all contestable assumptions, including assumptions about the way society works. It would be as far as could possibly be pure logic. The Austrian economists, who were one of the main wings of marginalism, understood correctly that this economics, the economics of marginalism, was really much less a branch of causal science than it was a branch of formal logic. Now, how then does it acquire content? It acquires content by importing from the outside the fuel of the factual stipulations, of the causal theories, and of the normative commitments. It doesn't have any fuel of its own. When it is pure, it is impotent, and it achieves explanatory or programmatic potency only by becoming impure. And this is related to a curious feature of its relation to mathematics. You all know this economic supposedly reveres mathematics and prizes mathematical ability very highly. Why then is almost all the mathematics used by this economic what a mathematician would consider toy mathematics? There's almost no mathematics used in contemporary economics that was invented after the middle of the 19th century. And the answer is not that the economists are not clever enough to use the higher mathematics used in basic physics. The answer is that it would serve no purpose in the economics they do, because the economics they do requires only deductive reasoning, which is only a small part of the current work of mathematics. And that's why it's this toy mathematics. Now, then, what is the procedure? The procedure is against the background of this very bare bones conceptual scheme. maximizing choice, instrumental rationality in the context of scarcity. The economist then chooses models. The switching of models in the economics that resulted from marginalism never involves the subversion of theory, because the theory can't be subverted. The theory is just an idealized logical situation. It doesn't really say anything about the world. It just stipulates this objective of maximizing choice against the background of scarcity. So, a true science, like fundamental physics, despite all its problems, always involves an interaction, a dialectic between the study of nature and the development of theory. And as the anomalies increase, eventually the dike breaks, and one theory is replaced by another theory. In this economics, in this analytic science, that can't happen, because there's no set of discoveries that could ever discredit the theory. The theory is not capable of being discredited. And it's this invulnerability which the marginalists deliberately chose that condemns the economics that they produced to eternal infancy. This is a science, if we're to call it a science, when it's really a form of logic, that can't grow up. It can't grow up because it can't make itself vulnerable in the way that a real science would have to do. The second defect of this economics is its institutional emptiness. So first, with respect to the market itself, the bearer of the idea of rationality, of rational choice against the background of scarcity, is the abstraction of the market. And we've discussed in the course why this abstraction, in fact, has no determinate content. There is no natural, necessary, and singular form of the market order. A market can take an indefinite number of forms. In the middle of the 20th century, there was a debate, the debate about market socialism, and the conclusion of the debate is that if marginalist economics is sufficiently rigorous and sufficiently pure, it can be used even for the exploration of a command economy. It doesn't even require the abstraction of the market. All it requires is this idea of maximizing choice against the background of scarcity. So with respect to this problem of its relation to its institutional assumptions, there are three types of economics. The first is pure economics. Pure economics as in the general equilibrium theories of the 20th century. It makes no institutional assumptions, not even the assumption of the existence of a market order, as I just said. It's entirely innocent. Don't touch me, I did nothing, I'm blameless. I did nothing. That's pure economics. It's pure and impotent. The second type of economics is fundamentalist economics. Fundamentalist economics is the economics that assumes that there is one exemplary form of the market order. It says the opposite. The idea of the market is not empty. It has a determinate institutional consequences. The extreme form of this idea is Hayek in his school. But most of the fundamentalist economics that we actually encounter in the world is what you could call a light fundamentalist. And it takes, for example, a form to which Danny alluded just now in his early segment, that it's not that there's one particular institutional formula that is universal, but there are principles that are intermediate between the idea of the market and the particular market order. And these principles then are universal. I would want to argue that if you examine those principles one by one, you can see why they're not universal. And some of them are just plain flat wrong. So the light fundamentalism is just as misguided as the radical fundamentalism. The third version of economics with respect to these institutional assumptions is what you would call equivocating economics. And it is exemplified by the macroeconomic ideas of the American economists. It wants to search for law-like relations between large-scale economic aggregates, like the level of inflation and the level of employment. That was the so-called Phillips curve. There's a relation between monetary policy and unemployment. Now, then someone comes and challenges the proponent of these pseudo-laws and says, these relations that you claim are universal and necessary and logical, in fact depend on a host of concrete institutional assumptions. For example, how is labor organized? What are the powers of labor vis-a-vis capital? Who has the power to determine monetary policy? How is monetary policy formulated? So change any of those assumptions, and these laws that you claim you've discovered will disappear, as indeed the Phillips curve disappeared because of relatively modest institutional changes. If, however, this macroeconomist, this equivocating economist, lives in a society which is in fact relatively stagnant in its repertory of institutions and policies, he can make this concession, say, you're right, your challenge is valid, but then he can go back to what he was doing before. It's what the lawyers call confession and demur. He can say, that's true, but it doesn't matter, because if his society is stagnant, he can readily confuse stagnation with lawfulness in these relations. And that's the equivocating economics. So that's the second defect of this tradition. Now, the third defect is that in this economic, there is no proper view of production. If you open one of the textbooks that they produce, you'll see there's a chapter called Production. But if you look at what's in that chapter, you won't find anything like the subjects that we've been discussing in the course. It's about, for example, the substitution of one kind of input or factor of production for another, the elasticity of the substitution, and the kinds of market order that are related to the substitution of input. It's not about the stuff that you would think is production. And it's not surprising, most of these people are more acquainted with hedge funds than they are with factories. They rarely have the interest that Adam Smith and Karl Marx had in the actual production of things. In the work of the two greatest economists in the history of economic thought, Adam Smith and Karl Marx, the theory of production was tantamount in its weight, in its presence in their ideas, to the theory of exchange. In this economics, the theory of production is a shadowy extension of the theory of exchange. It's just like an annex to the theory of exchange. And the realities of production are seen through the lens of relative prices, and they're being seen through the lens of relative prices. It's facilitated by a contingent feature of these societies in which this economics exists. Namely that in them, in those societies, labor can be bought and sold. And because labor can be bought and sold, it can be seen under the lens of relative prices. The paradigmatic work of the marginalist economics was supposedly the explanation of relative prices, of the system of relative prices. Although It has never, to my knowledge, been used to explain relative prices in any particular real economy. But that was the model, that was the paradigm which was supposed to be followed. Now, the fourth law of this economics has to do with its lack of any theory of the genesis of the diversity of the stuff from which comparative selection selects. And that is why I would compare it to the neo-Darwinian synthesis in the life sciences. In the neo-Darwinian thesis, there is a theory of competitive selection. That's Darwinian natural evolution. And then there's the other part, which is the theory of genetic mutation and recombination, which explains the diversity of the stuff from which the competitive selection selects. If you don't know the second thing, you don't know the value of the first thing. The first part of the theory has no precise significance except when connected to the second part. In this economics, the second part is entirely missing. And it's so missing that the division of the world into different states and economies, which is, after all, one of the fundamental sources of diversity, has no proper economic significance for this economy. The world might just as well be organized as a single economy, and from the narrow standpoint of this economist, of this economics, that would be better, because there would be no transactions costs. Diversity has no value. Those are, to my mind, the real criticisms of this economics. Now let me make a final set of remarks about the major economic heresy of the 20th century, which is Keynesianism. So this economics, which is marginalism plus empiricism, or plus importation of causal theories from other sciences, was not the only thing. There was a heresy, an aborted heresy, a partial heresy, an unfinished heresy, which was Keynes's economics. And the fundamental reason why it was unfinished is that Keynes was very worldly, and he wanted to have influence and prestige and shine in his own time. And we all know that we are unable to change the world. So Keynes deliberately downsized his own theory and evaded the questions that would associate him with the wrong people. So Keynes's theory, introduced a series of novelties in economic thought. So money matters. One of these modern economies is not like a barter economy. He said, there's not just one equilibrium between supply and demand. There are a multiplicity of possible equilibriums. And some of them maintain the economy at a low level of production, and others at a high level of production. So the economy is not a perpetual motion machine. And there has to be a political will from the outside, if there is insufficient demand, to raise up the demand and to take it from the low equilibrium to the high equilibrium. So what are the flaws in Keynes's economics? Keynes's economics was a partial deviation. You can't really say of it, as you could of marginalism, that was empty of causal theorizing. It had elementary theorizing. To the extent that it had elementary theorizing, the theorizing was psychological. And in this respect, it is characteristic of the dominant tradition of English political economy. England was the fatherland, the patria, this economics. And all the crucial variables in Keynes's system are psychological rather than institutional. The preference for liquidity, the propensity to consume, the state of long-term expectations, they're all psychological concepts. When there's any institutional discussion in Keynes, it's It's about a particular corner of the economy, like the stock market. Now, second, it's not a theory about the supply side of the economy. It's a theory about the demand side of the economy. It's all focused on demand. And in the real process of economic growth, constraints on the supply side have to be broken together with constraints on the demand side. And one of the great mysteries is that there's no simple equivalent or connection between breaking a constraint on the demand side and breaking a constraint on the supply side, or vice versa. So it's not a natural context for the formulation of a productivist project. In his newspaper articles in the 1920s and 30s, Keynes flirted with ideas about gaining political influence over the investment decision and over strategies of production. But he abandoned these ideas because he feared that they would associate him with the socialists. The third defect of Keynes's economics is that it's not, as it claims to be, a general theory of slumps, of economic crisis. In economics, it's a theory of growth. That's half of the theory of the core of economics would be. The reverse side of it is the theory of breakdown of growth, the theory of slumps. It's a theory of a very particular kind of slump, a slump dominated by insufficient demand, by the diversion of saving into unproductive hoarding, and into the rigidity of a particular price, the price of labor. We need a general theory of slumps, but Keynes's economics is not that theory. And the fourth defect is that, to the extent, its greatest novelty is that it contains the germ, the seed, of a theory not just of multiple equilibria, but of permanent disequilibrium in the economy. But Keynes did not develop this. So what happened to Keynesianism in the world? Well, in the United States, the American disciples of Keynes domesticated Keynes by depoliticizing. So what they did was they downsized Keynesianism into a theory of counter-cyclical management of the economy through fiscal and monetary policy. And they labeled this theory of fiscal and monetary policy macroeconomics. And the marginalist economics, which is the whole corpus of the preceding economics, was then called microeconomics. So now you open a textbook of economics in the United States, and what was intended originally to be a rivalry of two approaches to economics now turns out to be two chapters of the same textbook. There's microeconomics and there's macroeconomics. So that's what happened in the United States. And the person who was made to blame for this was not Paul Samuelson, the leader of the American economists. The person to blame was Keynes, because he is the person responsible for not having radicalized his own vision and made it susceptible to this diminishment. And what happened in the world is that when the leftists abandoned faith in Marxism, as they generally have, they became vulgar Keynesians. So it's this cheap Keynesianism that then became the successor to the unbelievable Marxism which they had embraced before. So there you have the situation in the world. Now you go around the world, and in most countries, not in the United States, but in most countries, the intelligentsia is divided into two factions. One faction are the neo-Marxists. They receive from the zeitgeist an axe. With this little axe, they've cut Marxism in two. They've kept the bad part, the historical fatalism, and they've thrown out the good part, the transformative aspirations. These are these pseudo-leftist fatalists who are now half of the world intelligentsia. The other half are the copy American-style social science, especially economics. But this particular operation that I described of the economists, which consists in switching models without undermining theory, has no equivalent in the social sciences. The only equivalent to it is Hans Kelsen's pure theory of law. Kelsen was the most influential jurist in the 20th century, and he produced this formalistic theory of law, barely known in the United States, but the most influential legal theory in the world, in the rest of the world. And that's the only equivalent. Each of the social sciences severs the vital connection between insight into the actual and imagination of the possible in its own way. Like Anna Karenina, at the beginning of Anna Karenina. All happy families are alike, but every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And the severing of this link is the peculiar form of the unhappiness of each of these disciplines. That's then the situation in the world. So what's the problem? So you could say, Danny and I are both sympathetic to these reforms that we've been discussing in the semester. Who cares if there's this theoretical difference of these methodological? It matters. It matters for the imagination of the future, for the imagination of the radical alternatives. It matters to humanity that it not have a mystified, fetishistic vision of its own world. So look now, see when a heretic comes like supposedly Piketty, French economist, who's written about inequality. Now, what does he produce? The complaints of the social democrats that society is too unequal, and the solutions of the social democrats, tax them, and things like that. There's no institutional vision. There's no vision of structure, and that's the direct result of the hegemony of the marginalist tradition. So I say, accept its somber, sullen discipline of constraints and trade-offs, but burn it down and produce another intellectual element.
Questions, comments? You're not going to let him get away with that, right?
Yes.
Can you tell us more about how you think about scarcity and whether
How I think about what?
scarcity? So as you laid out the kind of marginalist framework, there's a core assumption that there's scarcity, and in the way that you're proposing.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the word.
Scarcity.
Oh, scarcity, yeah.
Should we, if someone was to burn down the entire edifice and start from scratch, should they not assume that there is scarcity? Is that kind of what you
There
mean?
is scarcity, of course. And let me go back to another part of the ideas of Marx and Keynes. So Marx and Keynes both had the idea. Marx in the introduction to the Critique of the Gotha Program, and Keynes in his essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. Then we're on the eve of being liberated from scarcity. They thought we're going to have a society of abundance, and this terrible business of talking about money and production and so forth will be over. We'll be poets and fishermen and so forth. And the second idea was work. Instrumental work in the production system is a nightmare, which dehumanizes us. Now, I think both these ideas are wrong. We're not on the eve of overcoming scarcity. Scarcity is endlessly produced and reproduced in new ways. And second, work does not need to be a hateful word. Work can transform us. We don't need to be just free from the economy. We can be free in the economy. And already when we compare the military organization for this mass production with what came afterwards, the insular and therefore perverse knowledge economy, in the knowledge economy there are more opportunities for creation, for freedom than there are in the command and control for this mass production. So they're both false. So scarcity is indeed a persistent characteristic of the economy. The knowledge economy has begun to undermine what comes closest to being the most universal law of economic life, which is diminishing returns to any input at the market, the law of diminishing returns, and which the marginalists absurdly thought was just a logical implication, they said. They thought it was a logical implication of the principle of constant returns to scale. Because if there are constant returns to scale and you have a new input, the returns to the input must decline. Otherwise, the so-called principle of expanding returns, of constant returns to scale would be violated. But constant returns to scale was never a principle. Constant returns to scale is a residual de facto assumption. It plays in economics the role that constant motion plays in Newtonian mechanics. It's constantly violated in fact. A bigger factory can be more efficient or less efficient than a smaller factory. There's no logical or practical necessity. The real basis of the diminishing marginal returns is the discontinuous or episodic character of innovation. And to the extent that the knowledge economy makes innovation perpetual and internal to the process of production, it begins to erode the necessity of the law, of a true law of diminishing marginal returns. And that would take us in another direction. So it's the investigation of that kind of question which should be part of the work of economics. It's not good enough for it to be this commonsensical, logical, deductivist exploration of the constraints and be the man who comes at the door with the bill. That's not, I want more than that. And it was more than that in the hands of people like Adam Smith and Karl Marx.
There was another question or comment, I think.
Yes.
I might have not understood everything. I also presume I didn't understand everything.
Are you using the mic?
I think I am. Go on.
You speak.
Okay, then speak loud.
From what I understand, the basic criticism is that economics always begin from the point of maximizing choice. Both lacks a normative power to explain, both lacks normative power, but also lacks an explanatory power, because it doesn't say. It's sort of tautology to say that what you want is to maximize choice. But then I think that the reason that economics can do that is because it's not meant to be a standalone science as physics is, but rather because it has political thought to build off, and political thought major the idea of liberty and fulfillment and allowing the person to have multiple choice as a normative idea worth defending in itself. And once you have that normative idea, then economics can be essentially, does not have to readdress the normative question. It's essentially.
But that's not my complaint. My fundamental complaint, which I say at the outset, was my second proposition, is what it means to understand something. What is understanding? Understanding is always transformative. This is nothing about the normative versus the empirical. What is insight? Insight is imagination. And imagination is the understanding of transformation, a possible transformation. If you look at something and you don't have any view of how it can change, you don't understand it, period. Because that's what understanding is. Understanding is understanding of transformation. If all you can do is construct a model of it and show how it works, and you have no conception of where it came from or where it's going, of how it changes, of how you can change it, or how someone can change it, you just don't understand it. That's a perversion of the idea of understanding. So I do believe that there's an affinity between our practical interest in transformation and our cognitive interest in the understanding of the world. And it's that connection which is not properly performed by a science that doesn't want to be involved in the troubles and conflicts of its time, which is what this science was when it was invented at the end of the 19th century. It performed a series of clarifying operations. It got rid of all of the underbrush of the discussion of value. There were a series of scholastic disputes in economics for hundreds of years about the relation between price and value. So value was about the ultimate sources of wealth, and price is the surface, the monetary expression. They got rid of that. They found a way of accounting for price, liberated from this mystical idea of value, use value, exchange value. That was an undoubted achievement. But in return for that, they then retreated to this position of neutrality, which is of the three forms of economics that I described with respect to institutions. That's the posture of what I call pure economics. Pure economics says, I present you with a theory which is innocent of any assumptions, normative, structural, anything, and which can be applied to any kind of economic organization, including a command economy. So it's pure, and that's what they wanted, purity, and what they got was impotence, explanatory impotence and programmatic impotence. That's what they chose. And that's the same thing as in Kelson's pure theory of law. Yes?
Can you say more about your critique of the neo-Marxist tradition? I got that.
I didn't say anything about the neo-Marxist vision.
Okay.
I spoke about the intelligentsia.
Okay. So
There's
the
a faction of the intelligentsia which has taken from Marxism the fatalistic idea. So there are laws in history, there's a correlation of forces, and we have to obey it. We have to surf on the correlation of forces that exist in the world. That's not Marx, but that's their Marxism. And then there's the American-style social science, which is also a retrospective rationalization of society, of social order, in many different forms. One of the forms being this neo-marginalist economics. And so there are these two choruses of fatalism. They claim to be antagonists. but in fact they're allies. Yes.
So I'm trying to build some bridges between the first framework and the first distinction of paradigms and models, and the
Theories and models.
yeah,
Models and paradigms.
yes,
Models and paradigms.
yes. So for my understanding, your main critique is within models, not only paradigms. Like I first understand like marginalism and Keynesianism as paradigms, but now I understand like your critique is more about only focusing on models and
No,
like
my
this.
critique about the actual analytic practice is that its crucial move always is to switch models. So it's what Groucho Marx said. I have principles, and if you don't like them, I have other ones. So you switch the principles, and you don't subvert the model. You don't subvert the theory. The theory is invulnerable. That's not what science should be like.
Yes.
So it's not an advantage for science to be barred against subversion. That's destructive of the science. How is it going to progress? It's always going to be the same.
I agree with that, but my question now is, should we focus more on building new paradigm, like at your final remark, and like we are trying here to build a new paradigm of
Well, I'm
economics to
confused
apply
about the
models?
concept. The
Or-
reason why I'm confused about the concept of paradigm is that it seems to combine a cognitive element with a political or programmatic element. The paradigms are on society, right? And in this discussion, I'm trying to focus specifically on the cognitive element, this form of intellectual practice. And it seems to me that the most notable attribute of this form of intellectual practice is it wants to be blameless. It wants to say, I'm not responsible for this.
No, well, let me come in here. So this is the discussion probably in which we have the greatest amount of disagreement. And so so many of the things. So it's interesting that many of the things that you've said that I disagree with, and I'll just mention very quickly some of them. And then there are other things that you said that I agree with, but I think are a good thing, not a bad thing. So, so I think the first thing you said, economics is not the study of the economy, but it's I would say it's, and I think that's absolutely right. So economics has turned into a way of thinking rather than a study of the economy, which is why the tools of the economists are now being used.
And where it's used to studies of non-economic
very
It's called economics.
Well, it's depending on sort of which field. It could be called political economy if it's applied to political science. But I think there's a way of thinking about it that way of thinking has shown its power, whether it's in terms of theorizing, model building, or in terms of the tools of empirical analysis, and why economics in that way has become sort of like has exhibited a certain imperialism within the social sciences, and therefore, I think so. It is absolutely true, though, that when you're studying economics, whether it's as an undergraduate or a graduate student, you're not studying the features of an economy as they exist. Those might be brought in as illustrations and so forth. So I agree with you. I think the counter argument, and why I think that may not be a bad thing, would be precisely to say that that the point is to teach you about social phenomena that you can sort of apply to any kind of an economy or any kind of a social context, but subject to the caveat that I was bringing in, which is that you need to understand that the way that economics work is now is precisely not the way that natural sciences work, which is that successive theories replacing older ones that have proven to be inapplicable or having serious shortcomings. Instead, economics, I think, advances in a way that you don't like, but I think it's an advantage and particularly relevant to a social context, which is after all infinitely adaptable and variable. It advances by actually horizontally, that is by increasing the variety of settings to which we can sort of bring those models to bear. So that's a fundamental difference. And I agree with some of your criticism of economists in the sense that I think, you know, that they tend to get excessively wedded to one of these particular specifications. And it's not true that they actually want to say, oh, if you don't like this model, I have another one. That's actually my defense. Most economists stick to their preferred model for far too late. So it's interesting that let me just say just a little bit more about this. So, for example, Adam Smith had tremendous insight into the economies, indeed the global economy of his time, and you learn incredible amount about history and institutions when you read it. And he had a certain amount of insight about how economy and society works in general. And I think the contribution of contemporary economics has been to devalue that description of history and context and actual existing political and social institutions, and to distill some general ideas, but to do so in a way that actually can build understanding about how some of those general relations can work. For example, to be very concrete, so the most important, or one of the most important general ideas that Adam Smith was contributed was what has come to be called the invisible hand theorem, right? That the idea that if you essentially left people to pursue their self-interest, that in aggregate the collective interest is well served. Now that's a critical insight, and that's probably the most important, along with the division of labor, critical economic insight that he brings in. But what we have learned, and what only contemporary economics has enabled us to understand, is precisely the conditions under which the invisible hand theorem holds, and when it fails. And then when it fails, what is the way to fix it? So through a succession of models, so we start by first, let's say, oh, the invisible hand, fine, but what if we have monopoly, or the invisible hand fails? And then we say, oh, what happens if we have externalities or technological spillovers? It'll fail. And then later, what about if there are imperfections in information, and there's no complete information will work? And then even more recently, what if people aren't behaving rationally? That is, there are departures from rationality. All of these are models within economics. And so what has that done? It hasn't led us to drop the invisible hand theorem as completely outmoded or useless. It's just said that that's one of many possible outcomes that hold under certain assumptions. There are other models that hold under different kinds of outcomes. So what we have done, I think, as economists, where we've increased our understanding of the world, is not by jettisoning older models in favor of newer ones, by building a larger library of models that apply to more concrete set of circumstances.
Without changing the context of theory, of general theory.
Well,
The theory
without changing, again, because it's not a theory of the economy, it's a way of thinking. What has not changed is the way of thinking, and the way of thinking is the use of the sort of approach of models combined with empirical applications.
Deductive reasoning.
Exactly, the models are deductive reasoning, exactly.
Deductive reasoning.
But it is you said that earlier for the
And
theory.
no science, and there's no other science like that. That's not what there is.
No, but and maybe there shouldn't, exactly, maybe there shouldn't be, because it's a science of society, and there is nothing, there's nothing fixed about society.
This was
in the sense that
never the only
it's not a
science.
permanent reality that it's trying to capture. And in that sense, it's actually better adapted to the materialistic studies than the natural sciences, which are, studying, a setting which involves, leaving aside human, global warming, that's due to human influences, that's largely evolving within itself. So, I mean,
There were many paradigms, many approaches to economics, radically different from marginalism, even in England. So, for example, a rival to marginalism was Alfred Marshall. And Alfred Marshall wanted an economics which would be the equivalent to natural history. It would be, the analogy would be the science of the weather, or the science of tides, low-level causal sequences, which would be the object of AI.
And I think most good applied economists work in the Marshallian mode, because they are applying these tools in a very highly specific context, and they're very above board, explicit about what those contexts are. And I think so that's the most useful. So I think Keynes himself was a Marshallian, except that he was studying the macroeconomy. And we see the same cycles about succession of models. So I don't think that, for example, Keynesianism displaced the classical model. It just provided a different version of how the macroeconomy works when the binding constraint is on the demand side.
Well,
of the economy.
as I argued, it wasn't a general theory of slumps.
Right.
It was a theory of a particular kind of slump. So now at the start of the 21st century, there's so-called balance sheet recessions, and they say, well, that requires a different theory.
Well, because social reality changes. I mean, I don't know why you want to confine it. It's
I don't want to
because
confine
the
it.
whole notion of the balance sheet recession didn't make sense in the context of an economy where the financial sector wasn't as large as it became. So it's natural
But
that
the idea was to have, what Keynes wanted was a general theory of slumps. And then the theories of the particular kinds of slumps emerges from that.
So I guess my point would be that we can't have I think it's pointless to search for a general theory in the social sciences in the way that you're looking.
No, it's
But-
not
but-
a general
so-
theory of
but-
everything. It's a general theory of some topic, like economic slumps. Now, I think we
But
have.
why do you want to give up on the idea that slumps might be caused by a variety of different things?
Of course
And
they
then,
do.
and we don't have a closed list of what those causes
Of
are.
course they are.
So a single theory couldn't
And that's the whole
possibly.
idea of having a general theory of them. They're not a general, it isn't a theory that would explain all the types of slumps in the same way. It's a kind of, they're radically different kinds of slumps. But the way in which we understand some bears a connection to the ways in which we understand others.
Right, but I think the way
Differentiation
it
and
is.
generalization.
But exactly, but you're moving closer to my description of what these different models do. It's exactly. And let me say one other thing about that. I think you ended, this is important, and maybe we might want to end it. So you basically say, where does the imagination come from, right? And it's not, and so here again, we agree, the imagination, the institutional imagination, is not coming from economists, because the kind of training that economics provides is not one that encourages thinking in such terms. And so there again, we completely agree.
Once
But
again, my economics, but this economics.
right, my economics, I'm a proud equivocating economist. But I would say, I don't know why you're expecting economists or economics to be the source of that imagination. I think that
I expect
imagination should
everyone
come.
to be the source of the highest sense.
Exactly.
Now, we haven't spoken about another thing, which I think should be mentioned before the class is over, which is, we're talking about this in abstraction from the distribution of intellectual opportunities in the world. This economics, the economics that resulted from Marxism, now has a stranglehold over the economics.
Note the
department
pointing
of the
the
American-
finger.
American research universities. And they in turn have a stranglehold over the study of economics worldwide. And this is a sickness. This is a terrible calamity for humanity.
Next thing you blame the federal cut-off funding of Harvard and economists too.
No, so this is the real situation. This discipline is not just like people lost in the library. These people are standing behind the power holders.
Well, I think that's wrong, and I think we avoid that
Wrong
by
for them
having.
to do that, or
It's wrong for economists to be taken so seriously. And on the other hand, I think we're living in real time the cost, the very deep, sharp cost of economics not being taken seriously. So I think, unfortunately, we're seeing both in ways that I would not have thought possible. So next week, our final session, where we'll fix everything. We'll come to
I
a real
think we
agreement.
should talk, I think we should have the students talk about the general themes of the course in relation to the papers they're writing. Because there hasn't been as much opportunity for discussion as we would like.
I think that's a great idea.
So why don't we use the last class for that? But then everyone should come equipped with remarks, with questions, which may of course be related to the papers you're writing, which should spill over to encompass the whole field of our undeveloped issues.
Wonderful. You have your marching orders.
Thank you.